We got lost. It was my mistake." The words echoed through the darkness, a trembling whisper carried on the wind through ancient pines. A voice cracked with fear, heavy with guilt, belonging to someone who knows they led their friends into something terrible. The camera captures only fleeting glimpses, a pale face illuminated by a dying flashlight, branches scraping against fabric, the rhythmic thud of a heart beating in panic. In the suffocating blackness of Gifford Pinchot National Forest, someone is running. Someone is hiding. Someone knows they made a choice that can never be undone. The forest listens, indifferent and eternal, as another group of hikers learns that some paths should never be taken. The morning sun filtered through the towering Douglas firs as four friends gathered in the parking lot of Canyon Creek Campground, their laughter cutting through the crisp mountain air. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, 2 days of hiking, 1 night under the stars, and memories to last a lifetime. They had planned this for months, poring over maps during lunch breaks, debating gear choices late into the night, building anticipation with every passing week. Alex stood by the truck, methodically checking his backpack for the third time. At 32, he was the natural leader of the group, the one everyone turned to when decisions needed making. His movements were confident, practiced. He'd done this dozens of times before. The compass hung from his neck like a talisman, and his worn hiking boots spoke of countless trails conquered. He adjusted the straps on his pack and called out to the others with easy authority. "Everyone ready? We got about 6 miles to the first checkpoint. Then I'll set up camp near Cascade Falls." Eric hunched over the map spread across the hood of the car, his finger tracing their planned route for what must have been the 10th time that morning. 30 years old and perpetually anxious, Eric was the group's cautious voice, the one who always checked the weather forecast twice and packed extra supplies. His brow furrowed as he studied the contour lines, mentally calculating elevation gains and potential hazards. The map crinkled under his nervous fingers. "Are we sure about this trail?" Eric's voice carried a note of worry. "There's a storm system moving in tomorrow afternoon. We should keep that in mind." Maria laughed, slinging her bright red backpack over her shoulders with practiced ease. 28, irrepressibly optimistic, she was the glue that held the group together, always ready with a joke to diffuse tension or an encouraging word when spirits flagged. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. She'd been dreaming of this trip for weeks, escaping the suffocating routine of office life for the freedom of the wilderness. "Eric, you worry too much," she said, grinning. It's going to be perfect. Blue skies, fresh air, and no cell phones for 2 whole days. Paradise. Pete fumbled with his brand new backpack, trying to figure out how to properly adjust the hip belt. At 25, he was the youngest of the group and the least experienced hiker. This was only his 3rd time on a serious trail, and everything still felt awkwardly unfamiliar. The weight distribution, the rhythm of walking with a loaded pack, the strange vulnerability of being so far from civilization. But his enthusiasm made up for his inexperience, and his eagerness to prove himself pushed him forward. "I'm ready," Pete announced, though his pack sat crooked on his shoulders. "Let's do this." Alex smiled and shouldered his pack with an easy motion that spoke of years of experience. The group fell into formation, boots crunching on the gravel path that led from the parking lot toward the main trailhead. Above them, the sky stretched impossibly blue, and the forest hummed with life, birds calling from hidden perches, squirrels rustling through the underbrush, the distant rush of water over stone. It was the kind of morning that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen. They followed the wide, well-maintained trail that wound through stands of old-growth forest. Shafts of sunlight penetrated the canopy, creating pools of golden warmth on the forest floor. The air smelled of pine needles and rich earth, that clean scent that exists nowhere but deep in the woods. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the occasional pause to admire a particularly impressive tree or to let someone take a photo. Maria pulled out her phone to snap a selfie of the group, everyone pressed together and grinning. "Last photo before we go off the grid," she announced. The camera captured 4 smiling faces, flushed with excitement and anticipation. None of them could have known it would be the last normal moment they'd share. As they walked, Alex entertained them with stories from previous hikes. The time he accidentally set up his tent on an ant hill. The morning he woken to find a raccoon had stolen his breakfast. The sunset he he witnessed from the summit of Mount Adams that had moved him to tears. His confidence was infectious, and even Eric seemed to relax, his shoulders loosening as the rhythm of walking took over. "This trail is well marked," Alex assured them, gesturing to the bright orange blazes painted on trees at regular intervals. "I'll reach the junction in about 2 hours, then it's another mile to the falls." "Easy day." The trail climbed gradually, winding upward through the forest in long, lazy switchbacks. Their breathing deepened with the exertion, but no one struggled. They were all reasonably fit, and the pace was comfortable. Pete occasionally fell behind, distracted by interesting mushrooms or unusual rock formations, but he always caught up quickly, jogging to close the gap. They stopped for water at a small clearing where a fallen log provided natural seating. The forest opened up here, offering a glimpse of the valley below and the distant peaks beyond. Eric pulled out his map again, confirming their position with almost obsessive care. Maria stretched her legs and tilted her face toward the sun, savoring the warmth. Alex checked his watch and calculated their pace. Pete took pictures of everything, his camera clicking constantly. "We're making good time," Alex announced. "At this rate, I'll have the camp set up by early afternoon." Plenty of time to explore before dark. They shouldered their packs again and continued onward. The trail narrowed slightly as it entered a denser section of forest. Here the trees grew closer together, their branches interweaving overhead to create a green tunnel. The temperature dropped a few degrees in the shade, and the sounds of the forest seemed to grow quieter, more intimate. It was Maria who first noticed the side trail. A small wooden sign, weathered and partially obscured by moss, pointed to the left. "Deep trails. Cascade Falls shortcut 2.5 miles. The main trail continued straight ahead, but this alternative route promised to cut their hiking time significantly. "Look at this," Maria called out, stopping beside the sign. "We could save almost an hour if we take this shortcut." The group gathered around the junction, examining the alternative path. It was narrower than the main trail, less obviously maintained, with vegetation encroaching on the edges. But it was still clearly a real trail, not some random game path. The sign was official, even if it was old and weather-beaten. Alex studied the shortcut with interest, his mind already calculating the advantages. An extra hour at camp meant more time to relax, maybe even a swim in the falls if the water wasn't too cold. He pulled out his own map and traced the route with his finger. The shortcut did indeed connect to their destination, forming a triangle with the main trail they'd been following. "It is a legitimate trail," Alex said thoughtfully. "Just less travel. Probably why it's not as well maintained." Eric, his face had already clouded with worry. He leaned in to examine the sign more closely, noting how the wood had weathered, how the paint had faded. His instincts screamed caution, that little voice in the back of his mind that always warned him away from risks. "I don't, Eric said slowly. "If it is less maintained, it might be harder to follow. We should stick to the main trail. It's marked clearly, and we know exactly where it goes." But Maria was already peering down the shortcut trail, her sense of adventure sparked. The path disappeared around a bend about 50 yards ahead, winding between massive tree trunks. Something about it appealed to her, the idea of taking the road less traveled, of having a small adventure within the larger adventure. "Come on, Eric," Maria said with a grin. "Where is your sense of adventure? It is still an official trail. We're not bushwhacking through unmarked territory." Pete moved to Maria's side, his inexperience making him eager to prove his boldness. He didn't want to be seen as the weak link, the one who slowed everyone down or needed special accommodation. If Maria thought they should take the shortcut, he was ready to follow. "I'm up for it," Pete said, trying to sound confident. It will be more interesting than following the highway trail." Alex stood at the junction, the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He looked down each path in turn. The wide, safe main trail that would definitely get them where they needed to go, and the narrower shortcut that promised efficiency and a bit of excitement. His confidence in his own abilities tipped the scales. He navigated plenty of trails before. What could go wrong on a marked path, even a less maintained one? "All right," Alex said finally, his voice carrying the authority of leadership. I'll take the shortcut, but everyone stay together. If it gets too overgrown or hard to follow, we turn back." "Agreed." Eric opened his mouth to protest further but caught himself. The decision had been made, and he didn't didn't want to be the one always holding everyone back with his worries. He nodded reluctantly, folding his map with sharp, precise movements that betrayed his unease. Agreed, Eric said quietly, but just be careful. They adjusted their packs and turned onto the shortcut trail, leaving behind the wide, sun-dappled main path for the narrower route that promised adventure. The forest seemed to close in around them almost immediately, the canopy thicker here, the underbrush more aggressive. Their boots found the trail easily enough, but already it felt different, wilder, less tamed by human passage. None of them looked back at the junction. None of them saw the way the forest seemed to swallow the entrance to the shortcut behind them, or noticed how the bird song that had accompanied them all morning suddenly fell silent. They walked forward with confidence, trusting in their preparation, their equipment, and their leader, this experience. The choice had been made, the die had been cast, and somewhere deep in the forest, in that place where logic gives way to primal fear, the woods waited patiently for 4 more lost souls to wander into its depths. The shortcut trail started innocently enough. For the first 15 minutes, it seemed perfectly legitimate, narrow but clear, with occasional markers carved into tree trunks to confirm they were on the right path. The forest here was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, with massive ferns carpeting the ground and moss hanging from branches like green curtains. Alex led the way with steady confidence, occasionally pointing out interesting features. A particularly ancient cedar, a glimpse of a deer path intersecting their trail. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. The markers on the trees grew farther apart. The trail itself became less defined, with vegetation creeping across the path. The easy footing of the main trail gave way to roots and rocks that required more careful navigation. The group's pace slowed as they picked their way forward. Eric noticed at first that subtle shift from trail to something less certain. He stopped and pulled out his map again, trying to orient himself using the landmarks around them. But the problem with dense forest is that landmarks disappear. Every tree looks like every other tree. Every bend in the trail seems identical to the last. Are we sure we're still on the trail? Eric called ahead to Alex. Alex paused and looked around, then spotted a faded blaze on a tree trunk about 20 feet ahead. Yeah, I see a marker. We good. They continued forward, but the doubt had been planted. Pete, bringing up the rear, found himself glancing nervously at the thick vegetation pressing in on both sides. The casual confidence of the morning had faded, replaced by a growing awareness that they were moving deeper into wilderness, farther from the safety of well-traveled paths. Maria tried to keep the mood light, making jokes about feeling like explorers charting unknown territory. But even her laughter sounded a bit forced now, echoing strangely in the quiet forest. The silence itself was beginning to feel oppressive. No more birdsong, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of their own breathing and footsteps. The trail continued to deteriorate. What had been a clear path now required constant attention to follow. Several times Alex had to stop and search for the next marker, scanning the trees until he spotted a faded blaze or carved arrow pointing the way forward. Each pause ate away at their timeline and their confidence. How much farther do you think? Pete asked, his voice tight with growing nervousness. Alex checked his watch and did some mental calculations. We should be close. The shortcut was supposed to be 2.5 miles. They've been walking for 45 minutes? We must be near the end. But even as he spoke, doubt crept into Alex's voice. The trail had twisted and turned so much that it was hard to judge distance. They could have covered 2 miles or they could have covered 1. In the featureless forest, every sense of scale disappeared. The trees grew taller and more tightly packed. The canopy overhead thickened until only scattered fragments of sky were visible through the leaves. The light took on a greenish quality, filtered through layers of foliage. The temperature dropped noticeably as they moved deeper into shadow. They came to a place where the trail seemed to fork, or perhaps where 2 game paths crossed the hiking trail. Alex stopped, uncertain for the first time which direction to take. He searched for markers but found none. The worn path split in 2 directions, one heading slightly uphill, the other descending into a darker hollow. Which way? Maria asked, the worry now clear in her voice. Alex studied both options, trying to apply logic. The shortcut was supposed to lead them to Cascade Falls, which would be downhill toward the sound of water. He strained to hear the rush of a stream but heard only silence. Finally, he pointed toward the descending path. This way. We need to go downhill to reach the falls. They took the lower path, but it quickly became apparent that something was wrong. The trail, already faint, seemed to disappear entirely within 100 yards. They found themselves pushing through increasingly thick undergrowth, branches catching at their clothes and packs. Alex kept moving forward, unwilling to admit they might have made a mistake, searching desperately for any sign that they were still on track. "Alex, stop," Eric said sharply. "This isn't a trail anymore. We need to go back." Alex turned, his face flushed with exertion and frustration. Around them, the forest pressed in like a living thing, vegetation so thick they could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They were no longer on any kind of maintained path. They wandered off the trail, lured by a false route. "Okay," Alex said, his voice tight. I'll backtrack. Follow our footprints back to the junction." They turned around and began retracing their steps, but the forest that had seemed to part easily before them now felt like a maze. The undergrowth they pushed through had sprung back, erasing obvious signs of their passage. What had taken minutes to cross now took twice as long to navigate in reverse. When they finally made it back to what they thought was the junction, they found themselves in a small clearing that looked similar but not quite right. The two paths they'd seen before were gone, replaced by 3 or 4 possible routes through the trees. Panic began to bloom in Pete's chest, a cold knot of fear that made it hard to breathe. "This isn't the same place," Pete said, his voice rising. "Where are we?" Alex spun in a slow circle, trying to spot anything familiar. But in the monotonous repetition of trees and undergrowth, everything looked the same and nothing looked right. He pulled out his compass and checked their heading, but knowing which direction was north didn't help when he didn't know which direction they needed to go. Maria moved closer to Alex. Her earlier optimism completely evaporated. "Maybe we should try to find the main trail again. Go back the way we came from the junction." "I don't know which way that is anymore," Alex admitted, the words bitter in his mouth. Eric had his map out, but it was useless without landmarks. The map showed trails and campsites and geographical features, but when you standing in undifferentiated forest, a map becomes abstract art, interesting but unhelpful. His hands shook as he folded it back up. "We need to stay calm," Eric said, though his own voice betrayed his fear. "We can't be that far off track. Let's pick a direction and move carefully, looking for trail markers." They chose what seemed like the most promising direction and moved forward as a tight group, no one wanting to be separated from the others. The forest had transformed from beautiful wilderness into something threatening. Every shadow potentially concealing danger, every sound a possible threat. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, and the quality of light was changing, becoming more golden but also dimmer as the day aged. For an hour they searched, moving in widening circles, trying to find any sign of the trail they abandoned. But the forest revealed nothing, no markers, no signs, no hint of human presence. They were truly lost, wandering in wilderness with night approaching and no clear way out. It was Pete who found the first disturbing sign. He wandered a few yards from the group to investigate what he thought might be a trail marker when he stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center lay the remains of a camp, a torn tent, its fabric shredded and dirty, flapping in the slight breeze. A broken backpack lay nearby, its contents scattered across the ground. A mud-caked jacket, once bright orange but now dark with grime and mold. "Guys," Pete called out, his voice cracking. "You need to see this." The others hurried over and stopped short at the edge of the clearing, staring at the abandoned campsite. The scene looked wrong. Not the orderly departure of hikers breaking camp, but the chaotic remnants of something that had gone terribly wrong. The tent pole was bent at an unnatural angle. The backpack had been torn open, not unzipped. Personal items lay scattered and half buried in forest debris. Maria, his hand went to her mouth. "Who do you think?" "I don't know," Alex said quietly. "But they left in a hurry." Eric knelt beside the backpack, careful not to touch anything, as if the abandoned belongings were somehow sacred or dangerous. His mind raced through possibilities, each more frightening than the last. Had another group gotten lost here? Had they been attacked by an animal? Had they simply panicked and fled, leaving everything behind? "How long ago?" Pete whispered. "How long has this been here?" No one answered. The tent fabric was weathered and moldy, suggesting months or maybe years. But the sight of it, proof that others had been lost in this same wilderness, struck terror into their hearts. This could be them tomorrow, their own belongings left behind for the next lost hikers to find, becoming part of the forest, this collection of failed adventures. "We need to keep moving," Alex said, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "Before it gets dark." They left the clearing behind, but its image burned in their minds. The forest that had seemed merely confusing before now felt actively malevolent, as if it deliberately collected lost travelers, adding their stories to its catalog of tragedies. Every tree seemed to lean toward them. Every shadow concealed potential danger. The sounds of the forest changed as afternoon stretched toward evening. The silence that had been merely unsettling became oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or rustle in the undergrowth. Once, they all heard what sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps moving parallel to their path, but when they stopped to listen, the sound ceased. When they moved again, it resumed, staying just out of sight. "What is that?" Pete asked, his eyes wide with fear. "Probably an elk," Alex said, trying to sound reassuring. "Or a deer. They were curious sometimes." But none of them believed it. The footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They sounded too measured, too deliberate. They sounded like something following them, tracking their movements, waiting for what? The unknown possibility was worse than any definite threat. As the sun began to sink lower, the shadows stretched and merged. The forest transformed yet again, from threatening to genuinely frightening. Visibility dropped as the light faded, and every friend's face became harder to see. They drew closer together instinctively, no one wanting to be even a few feet from the others. "We need to find a place to camp," Eric said. "We can't wander in the dark." Alex wanted to argue, wanted to keep searching for the trail, but he knew Eric was right. Moving through unknown forest in darkness was asking for injury or worse. They needed to stop, to make camp, to wait for morning when they could see clearly and think rationally. They found a small clearing, barely large enough for their 4 bodies, surrounded by massive trees. It wasn't ideal. The ground was uneven and scattered with roots, but it would have to do. With shaking hands, they unpacked their camping gear, the simple tasks made difficult by fading light and mounting fear. Maria pulled out her phone, hoping against hope for a signal. The screen glowed bright in the growing darkness, showing no bars, no connection to the outside world. The phone was nothing but a flashlight now, its smart capabilities useless in the wilderness. She checked everyone else's phones with the same result, completely cut off. "Nothing," she said, her voice small. We're completely alone out here." The 4 of them stood in a circle in the growing darkness, and for the first time the full weight of their situation settled over them. They were lost. Night was falling. No one knew exactly where they were. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, and somewhere in that vast wilderness, others had been lost before them. The abandoned campsite proved that. Pete sank to the ground, drawing his knees to his chest. Maria sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Eric and Alex remained standing, both staring out into the darkening trees, watching for threats they couldn't name but could feel in their bones. The temperature continued to drop as the sun disappeared. Cold seeped up from the ground and down from the canopy. The warmth and brightness of the morning felt like a distant dream, something that had happened to different people in a different world. Now there was only the cold, the darkness, and the terrible awareness that they were utterly, completely lost. They managed to get a fire started in the clearing, Alex coaxing flames from dry twigs with trembling hands. The small circle of light it cast felt pitifully inadequate against the vast darkness pressing in from all sides. The 4 friends huddled around the flames, seeking warmth and the psychological comfort of light in the hostile darkness. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks spiraling upward into the night. For a few moments, they let themselves be hypnotized by the dancing flames, finding brief relief from their fear in the ancient human comfort of fire. The warmth on their faces made the cold at their backs more pronounced, a sharp reminder that the tiny sphere of light was all that separated them from the endless dark forest. "We'll all find our way out in the morning," Alex said quietly, but his words carried no conviction. He was saying what he thought a leader should say, what they needed to hear, but he didn't believe it himself. The compass and map in his pack felt like useless props now, tools that required knowledge he didn't possess. Maria had her arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly. Her optimism had been stripped away by hours of fear, leaving raw vulnerability. "How did we get so lost?" We only went a little way off the main trail. No one answered. The question hung in the air, accusatory and unanswerable. They made a choice at that junction, and somehow that single decision had led them into this nightmare. Each of them replayed the moment in their minds, wondering if they'd spoken up more strongly against the shortcut. If they insisted on caution, could they have prevented this? Eric sat with his back against a tree trunk, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Every sound made him tense. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. The forest was full of noises at night, sounds they never noticed in the safety of designated campsites with other hikers nearby. Now every sound felt like a potential threat. Pete hadn't spoken in over an hour. He sat curled up tight, his face buried against his knees. The excited young man who started the hike that morning had been replaced by this trembling, terrified version. When Maria reached out to touch his shoulder, he flinched. "It's okay," Maria whispered, though they both knew it wasn't. The fire began to die down, and Alex carefully added more wood, trying to conserve their supply while keeping the flames alive. They gathered what fallen branches they could find in the immediate vicinity, but in the dark, they didn't dare venture far to collect more. The fire was life, and once it went out, they'd be completely swallowed by darkness. Then came the sound that stopped their hearts. From somewhere in the forest, not close but not far enough away, came a long, low sound, something between a groan and a growl. It rolled through the darkness like thunder, making the hair on their necks stand up. They froze, eyes wide, barely breathing. "What was that?" Pete whispered, his voice barely audible. "Bear," Alex said hopefully. "Or maybe a cougar." But it didn't sound like any animal they ever heard. It sounded almost human, but deeply wrong, as if something were trying to imitate human vocalization without quite understanding how. The sound came again, slightly closer this time, and with it a crashing in the underbrush as something large moved through the forest. Eric grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it up like a weapon. "Maybe we should climb a tree, get up off the ground." "In the dark," Maria said, "we break our necks." The crashing sound circled their position, always staying just beyond the reach of the firelight. Whatever it was seemed to be studying them, learning their position, waiting for something. The rational part of their brains tried to insist it was just wildlife, curious about the light and noise. But the primitive part, the ancient survival instinct, screamed danger with every cell. They fed more wood to the fire, building it higher, creating more light. The flames leapt and danced, throwing wild shadows that made the surrounding trees seem to move and shift. In the flickering light, every tree trunk could hide a threat. Every shadow could conceal something watching. The circling sounds continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence crashed down like a weight, somehow more frightening than the noise had been. In noise, there was information, direction, distance, warning. In silence, there was only speculation and imagination. They sat rigid around the fire, muscles locked tight, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The forest had gone completely quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Even the usual night sounds, insects, frogs, distant owls, had ceased. The only sound was the crackle of their fire and their own rapid breathing. "Maybe it was gone," Pete ventured after a long pause. No one responded. They all knew that silence didn't mean safety. It might mean the opposite, that whatever had been making noise was now moving quietly, stalking rather than simply investigating. Alex felt the weight of responsibility crushing him. These were his friends, and he led them into danger with his confidence and his decision to take that cursed shortcut. If something happened to them out here, it would be his fault. The knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. "We should take turns keeping watch," Eric suggested. "2 people awake at all times. If anything approaches, wake everyone immediately." They agreed to the plan, though none of them thought they'd be able to sleep anyway. Fear was a better stimulant than any amount of caffeine. Alex and Maria took the first watch while Eric and Pete tried to rest, though rest meant lying rigid with their eyes closed, jumping at every sound. The night stretched on eternally. Time seemed to slow and warp in the darkness, minutes feeling like hours. Maria and Alex sat on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining the illusion of watch even though both knew they were just as frightened and helpless as those trying to sleep. They fed the fire branch by branch, watching the supply of wood dwindle with growing dread. Around what might have been midnight, they heard the sounds again, but this time they were different. Not the animalistic grunting and crashing, but something that sounded like voices. Distant, echoing, impossible to localize, but definitely human-like. Calling out words that couldn't quite be understood, singing fragments of songs that made no sense. "Do you hear that?" Maria whispered. Alex nodded, his face pale in the firelight. "There's no one else out here. There can be." But the voices continued, sometimes seeming to come from one direction, then shifting to another. Once, Maria could have sworn she heard her own name being called in a voice that sounded exactly like her mother. The temptation to call back, to shout for help, was almost overwhelming. But something deep inside warned her that responding would be the worst possible mistake. The voices faded as dawn began to break, that slow transition from black to gray that happens so gradually you don't notice until suddenly you can see the shapes of trees again. The fire had burned down to embers, their wood supply exhausted. The four friends looked at each other in the growing light, seeing the toll the night had taken in hollow eyes and pale, drawn faces. They hadn't really survived the night so much as endured it. And now they faced another day lost in the forest, their supplies limited, their fear amplified, and their hope of easy rescue evaporating like the morning mist. "We need to move," Alex said, his voice hoarse. "Find water. Find the trail. Find something." They packed up their sparse camp with mechanical movements, too exhausted for speech. Pete moved like a sleepwalker, barely aware of his surroundings. Eric, his hands shook so badly he could barely stuff his sleeping bag. Maria had silent tears running down her cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Maria stumbled over a root hidden beneath fallen leaves. Her ankle twisted painfully, and she fell hard, her leg scraping against a sharp broken branch. The pain was immediate and intense. When she pulled up her pant leg, blood was already flowing from a deep gash along her shin. "I'm bleeding," Maria said, her voice cracking with pain and fear. "I am bleeding." The sight of blood, real, red, flowing blood, made their situation suddenly, terrifyingly concrete. This wasn't just getting lost on a hike. This was genuine danger, real harm. Alex rushed to her side, pulling out their first aid kit with shaking hands. The kit, which had seemed adequate when they packed it, now seemed pathetically insufficient. He did his best to clean and bandage the wound, but blood continued to seep through the gauze. Maria bit her lip against the pain, trying not to cry out, but tears streamed down her face. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but out here, far from help, even a simple wound became a serious problem. "Can you walk?" Eric asked gently. Maria nodded, though her face was pale. "I think so. Just slowly." They helped her to her feet, and she took a few tentative steps, wincing with each one. The injury would slow them down significantly, adding another complication to their desperate situation. But they had no choice but to keep moving. Staying in one place meant dying in one place. As they left the clearing behind, the forest seemed to watch them go with cold indifference. The trees towered overhead, ancient and uncaring. The four friends stumbled forward into another day of being lost, injured, afraid, and completely, utterly alone. Behind them, in the ashes of their fire, something shifted and stirred. In the game trails between the trees, tracks appeared that couldn't quite be explained. And in the silence of the deep woods, the forest waited patiently for night to fall again. The search team found the clearing 3 days later, alerted by the friends, families when they failed to return from their weekend hike. What they discovered sent chills through even the most experienced rescue workers. The campsite was intact but abandoned. The tent stood partially erected, its sides flapping in the breeze. 4 backpacks lay scattered around a cold fire pit. Personal items, water bottles, a camera, sleeping bags, were spread across the clearing as if dropped in haste. But of the 4 hikers themselves, there was no sign. Officer James Morrison stood in the center of the clearing, his weathered face troubled. He'd been with search and rescue for 15 years, had found lost hikers alive and dead, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. The scene suggested panic, a sudden flight, but there were no signs of what they'd been fleeing from. No footprints leading out, one of his team members reported. It's like they just vanished. Morrison picked up a photograph that had fallen from one of the packs. 4 smiling faces looked back at him from a parking lot that morning. Alex Zhang, 32. Eric Hoffman, 30. Maria Castellanos, 28. Peter Novak, 25. They'd been happy, excited, ready for adventure. Now they were simply gone. The search expanded over the following days, covering dozens of square miles of wilderness. Helicopters flew overhead. Drones equipped with thermal cameras swept the forest. Dogs tracked through the undergrowth. But they found nothing. No bodies, no additional clues, no indication of where the 4 friends had gone after abandoning their camp. One member of the group had actually made it out. David Chen, who had been part of the original hiking party but had decided to take the main trail alone when the others chose the shortcut, reached the campground safely that evening. When the others didn't arrive, he reported them missing. In an interview at the ranger station, David's hands shook as he held a broken flashlight, the only thing searchers had found besides the abandoned camp. His voice barely rose above a whisper as he recounted the story. I called out to them. I screamed until my voice gave out. But the forest, it was like the forest swallowed every sound. There was nothing but silence. His eyes were haunted, filled with survivor, his guilt and something deeper, a primal fear he couldn't quite articulate. Why did I survive? Why was I the only one who made it out? The families gathered at the search headquarters, clinging to hope that grew thinner with each passing day. Maria, his mother, sobbed into her hands. Alex, his father, stood rigid, staring at maps as if he could will his son this location to appear. Pete, his younger sister, clutched a stuffed animal he'd given her years ago. Eric, his partner, sat alone, unable to process the impossibility of it all. Detective Sarah Williams reviewed the evidence for the press conference, her expression carefully neutral despite the gnawing unease in her gut. We thoroughly searched all known trails in the area. The campsite was found intact, with all the hikers' personal belongings present. At this time, we have no evidence of foul play, no trace of the missing individuals beyond the abandoned camp, and no clear explanation for their disappearance. She mentioned the things that bothered her most. The way the tent fabric had been torn from the inside, as if they declawed their way out in a panic. The strange marks on some of the trees surrounding the clearing, scratches that went too high up the trunk to be easily explained. The way her most experienced tracker had refused to stay in that clearing after dark, claiming it felt wrong. The official search was called off after 2 weeks. The case remained open, but without leads or evidence, there was nothing more to be done. The families held memorial services for hikers who might still be alive somewhere, lost in the endless expanse of Gifford Pinchot National Forest. The media ran stories for a while, then moved on to newer mysteries. But the forest remembered. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest covers over 1.3 million acres of wilderness in southwestern Washington state. Within that vast expanse are hundreds of miles of trails, thousands of acres that have never felt a human footstep, and pockets of old-growth forest so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground. It is beautiful and ancient and completely indifferent to human life. The disappearance of Alex Zhang, Eric Hoffman, Maria Castellanos, and Peter Novak is not unique. It is simply the most recent. In 2013, a hiker named Mary Kelly vanished on the same trail system. She told friends at the campground she was going on a spiritual journey and would be back by sunset. She was an experienced hiker, well-equipped and familiar with the area. She was never seen again. Her abandoned backpack was found 3 months later near Canyon Creek, miles from where she said she was hiking. Inside was a journal with her final entry, "The forest is alive. It watches. It waits. I can hear it breathing." In 2009, a group of 3 college students disappeared during a weekend camping trip. Their car was found at the trailhead, their permits properly filed with the ranger station, their route clearly marked on their map. Searchers found their first campsite, tent still standing, food still in the bear bag, but no sign of the students themselves. One of them managed to send a text message before the signal died. Lost. Followed voices. Wrong path. Can to find way back. In 2001, a father and son on a hunting trip never returned. The father was a local who had been hunting these woods for 30 years. He knew every ridge and valley, Searchers found their truck and their first day is camp, but nothing else. The son, his hunting jacket was discovered wrapped around a tree miles off any known trail, as if placed there deliberately as a marker or warning. The list goes on, stretching back decades. Not every year, not even every few years, but with disturbing regularity, people enter the Gifford Pinchot National Forest and simply cease to exist. Most of them are found eventually, sometimes alive and confused, sometimes dead from exposure or injury. But some, like Alex and his friends, vanish so completely it's as if they were never there at all. The official explanations are always the same: difficult terrain, easy to get disoriented, weather conditions, human error. All true, all reasonable, all insufficient to explain the pattern. Because while people get lost in every national forest in America, there is something different about Gifford Pinchot. Ask the rangers who worked there for years, and if you catch them at the right moment, they'll admit it. There are sections of the forest they want to enter, trails they recommend against, pockets of wilderness where the normal rules don't seem to apply. The indigenous peoples who lived in these lands long before they became a national forest had their own explanations. They spoke of places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where spirits walked, where the unwary could step through some invisible threshold and find themselves in a place that looked like the forest but wasn't, not quite. They marked certain areas as forbidden, taught their children to stay away from particular valleys and ridges where people were known to disappear. Modern rationality dismisses such stories as superstition, but the disappearances continue. And in the quiet moments, when the sun sets and the forest grows dark, even the most skeptical minds wonder if there might be some truth buried in the old warnings. The story of Alex, Eric, Maria, and Pete is a tragedy, but it is also a cautionary tale. Every year, thousands of people enter wilderness areas across the country. Most of them return safely, carrying nothing but memories and tired muscles. But some don't return, and the reasons often come down to a series of small decisions that compound into disaster. The first mistake was overconfidence. Alex believed in his own experience and abilities, and that confidence led him to choose the shortcut trail without properly assessing the risks. Confidence is necessary in the wilderness, but overconfidence kills. Every hiker, no matter how experienced, needs to approach the wilderness with respect and humility. The second mistake was group pressure. Eric had reservations about taking the shortcut, but he didn't push back hard enough against the group consensus. In outdoor adventures, everyone in the group needs to feel empowered to voice concerns and suggest alternatives. One person's doubt might save everyone's life. The third mistake was inadequate preparation. They had basic supplies and a map, but they hadn't studied the trail system thoroughly enough to have backup options. They hadn't left a detailed itinerary with anyone, specifying exactly which trails they planned to take and when they expected to return. They hadn't brought a GPS device or personal locator beacon. The fourth mistake was continuing forward once they realized they were off trail. The moment they lost sight of clear trail markers, they should have stopped, backtracked carefully, and, if necessary, stayed put and waited for rescue. Instead, they kept moving, getting more disoriented with each step. The fifth mistake was panic. Once fear took hold, rational decision-making became impossible. They scattered their energy instead of staying calm and methodical. Fear is natural in a survival situation, but it must be managed, not allowed to dictate actions. These lessons are written in tragedy, bought with the cost of 4 lives lost or changed forever. But they have to be learned through personal disaster. Every person who ventures into wilderness can study these mistakes and avoid repeating them. If you find yourself lost in the wilderness, remember these principles. Stop immediately when you realize you lost. To compound the problem by continuing to move randomly. Sit down, take deep breaths, and assess your situation calmly. Stay where you are if possible. This is especially crucial if you have filed a trip plan. Searchers will start from your last known location and work outward. If you keep moving, you make their job exponentially harder. Make yourself visible. If you are in a clearing or open area, stay there. Use bright colors to attract attention. Create signals that can be seen from the air. Logs or rocks arranged in geometric patterns. Brightly colored clothing spread on the ground. Prioritize shelter, water, and warmth. You can survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, but only 3 hours in harsh conditions without shelter. Focus your energy on staying warm and dry. Use sound to signal. 3 of anything, 3 whistle blasts, 3 shouts, 3 fires is the universal distress signal. But don't exhaust yourself calling constantly. Stay positive. Survival is as much mental as physical. Panic and despair are your true enemies. The most important rule, however, is prevention. Tell someone where you're going and when you'll be back. Carry proper equipment including a map, compass, GPS device, first aid kit, extra food and water, warm layers, rain gear, flashlight with extra batteries, whistle, and ideally a personal locator beacon. Study your route before you start. Stick to established trails unless you have advanced navigation skills. Turn back if conditions seem wrong. The wilderness is not malevolent, but it is indifferent. It doesn't care about your experience level, your good intentions, or your desire to get home safely. It simply exists, ancient and powerful and utterly neutral. Respect it, prepare for it, and approach it with the awareness that you are a guest in a realm where human rules don't automatically apply. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest is open today, as it was yesterday, as it will be tomorrow. Thousands of people will hike its trails this year. Most will have wonderful experiences, forming memories of natural beauty and personal accomplishment. The forest offers profound gifts to those who enter it with proper preparation and respect. But somewhere in its depths, in those pockets where the trail markers fade and the canopy grows thick, the forest keeps its secrets. 4 more names have been added to its long list of mysteries. 4 families live with absence and unanswered questions. And at the junction where Canyon Creek Trail meets the shortcut to deep trails, a weathered wooden sign still points the way into darkness. The investigation remains open, though no longer active. Alex, his father, still hikes the trails every few months, calling his son this name into the silence. Maria, his mother, maintains a website with photos and information, hoping someone somewhere might have seen something. Eric, his partner, moved away, unable to bear the proximity to the place where he was lost. Pete, his sister, refuses to ever enter a forest again. David Chen, the friend who survived, lives with questions that wake him at 3 a.m. and haunt his days. Why did he take the main trail? Why didn't he insist they all stay together? Why does he sometimes dream of his friends calling to him from between the trees? Their voices distorted and wrong, urging him to come find them. The forest doesn't answer these questions. It simply stands, silent and eternal, offering beauty and danger in equal measure to all who enter its realm. When you next walk a forest trail, when you stand surrounded by ancient trees with the canopies stretching overhead and the path winding ahead into shadow, remember this story. Remember that the wilderness demands respect. Remember that small decisions can have enormous consequences. Remember that confidence must be balanced with caution and adventure with preparation. Remember Alex, who wanted to take charge and lead his friends to adventure. Remember Eric, whose doubts went unheeded. Remember Maria, whose optimism couldn't save her from tragedy. Remember Pete, whose inexperience made him vulnerable. Remember them, and let their story guide your choices, because the forest is patient, and it always waits. In the deep places where sunlight fails to reach, in the tangled undergrowth where trails disappear, in the silence that falls when even the birds stop singing, there the wilderness remains, beautiful and terrible and utterly real. The choice to respect it, to prepare properly, to listen to warning signs and turn back when wisdom demands. These choices are always yours to make. Let this story be a reminder that those choices matter. Let it be a testament to the power of wilderness and the fragility of human life within it. The forest remembers those who enter and dawn to return. The forest keeps its secrets, and somewhere in the vast expanse of Gifford Pinchot National Forest, beneath the towering pines and ancient cedars, 4 friends remain lost in a darkness that no flashlight can pierce. Learn from their mistake, respect the wilderness, and if you ever find yourself standing at a junction where a shortcut trail promises an easier path through the forest, remember this story and choose the longer, safer way home.
Thank you for watching, guys. See you in next video. Bye bye.